Frozen solid in that blizzard, she nearly died, and pulling her out would change his life forever. 40 mounted warriors surrounded Jonah Carver's ranch at first light, riding out of the white Montana hills silent as smoke, armed and still, and Jonah stood on his porch counting them and understanding exactly what one night of kindness had started. The woman he had dragged from the snow the night before, snowblind, her hands pale as birch bark, barely alive when he found her in the dark, was not some displaced settler or a trapper's lost wife. She was the daughter of Chief Black Otter, and every man sitting that horse outside had come to decide whether Jonah would live to see another day. Watch till the end, because what happened in that frozen valley between a grief-hollowed rancher and the chief's daughter would change 2 worlds forever. And if you haven't already, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss a story like this one. Deep Winter, 1881. Montana Territory. Jonah Carver had nothing left to lose, which is the only thing that gave him the nerve to walk out that front door unarmed. The cabin sat at the far end of a long valley in the Bitterroot foothills, tucked below a ridge that blocked the worst of the north wind. In summer, the meadow below it ran thick with grama grass, and the creek stayed clear and cold. But by December of 1881, the meadow was buried under 3 feet of hard-packed snow, and the creek had gone silent under black ice. And Jonah Carver had gone to bed each night for the past 14 months, listening to the particular silence of a house where somebody used to be. Her name had been Clara. He had buried her the October before last in the small plot he had fenced behind the cottonwood grove, and the grave had a stone marker he had chiseled himself because the nearest stonemason was 40 miles east in Missoula, and 40 miles felt like another country that winter. She had died of a fever that started as a chest cold and moved fast. The doctor who came out from town said there was nothing to be done, and Jonah had listened to that verdict with the kind of still face a man wears when the words are landing but the meaning has not arrived yet. He was 34 years old. He had come to Montana from Wyoming 8 years earlier with 1 horse, a hammer and a stubbornness that his father had always said would either make him rich or kill him. He had built the cabin with his own hands, added the barn the second summer, strung fence line that stretched half a mile in either direction. He had run a decent herd of black Angus cattle that now numbered 63 head, grazing out past the tree line with the ranch dog keeping count. He had put in a kitchen garden, hung a proper door with iron hinges, and built Clara a rocking chair from ash wood that she had used every evening after supper until she couldn't any more. The chair still sat by the cold side of the fireplace. He had not moved it. He was not sure he ever would. He had 2 ranch hands who came in from the neighboring spread 3 days a week, brothers named Pete and Orlo Twitchell, who did not talk much and asked fewer questions, which suited Jonah fine. The rest of the time the valley was his and the cattle's, and the hawks that rode the thermals in summer. December of 1881 had hit the high country hard. There had been a storm the week before Thanksgiving that dropped 2 feet of snow, and then there had been another one, and then a cold snap that locked the temperature at 10 below for 6 days straight. Jonah had moved the youngest calves into the barn and spent most of his daylight hours breaking ice in the water trough and hauling extra hay from the upper loft. He had not been to town since the 1st of November, and he had no particular plans to go. It was the 22nd of December when the big storm came down from Canada. He had seen it building all afternoon, a wall of gray that swallowed the peaks to the north and kept coming, darker and lower with every passing hour. By 4 o'clock the wind had picked up, and by 5 it was howling down the valley with a force that rattled the barn doors. He got the last 2 calves inside just ahead of the worst of it, filled the water bucket in the kitchen, banked the fire with a good supply of cordwood, and settled in for what he knew would be a long night. He was reading by lamplight when he heard the sound. It was not a sound he could name immediately. Not an animal he knew, the coyotes and the deer and the occasional elk that came through the lower pasture. Not the wind, which had a different note entirely, high and continuous and hard. This was something between a cry and a gasp, carried to him on a gust that momentarily pressed against the north-facing window, and then gone. He set the book down. He sat still for a long moment, listening. The storm was bad enough that the sound could have been nothing, a branch snapping, a fence post shifting. A man who went out in that kind of wind on a hunch was a fool, or a man with nothing much to lose. Jonah supposed he was both, He pulled on his heavy coat, his hat, his gloves. He lit the lantern and opened the front door, and the cold hit him like a wall. The snow was driving sideways, and the lantern barely cut 10 feet through it. He stepped off the porch and turned toward the north end of the cabin, where the sound had seemed to come from, and he almost walked straight into her. She was down on one knee in the snow with her arms wrapped around herself and her face pressed against the cabin's log wall, as if the logs were the only solid thing left in the world. She was dressed in a heavy blanket coat and leggings and moccasins that had soaked through entirely. Her hair was dark and plastered across her face with ice crystals matted into it, and her eyes, when she heard him and raised her head, were glassed over with the particular look of someone who was very close to a place they cannot come back from. She did not scream. She did not speak. She looked at him with eyes that had gone past fear into something quieter and more frightening, and then her arm buckled, and she went down into the snow. Jonah Carver picked her up. He was not a man who spent much time deliberating about things once they were in front of him. Clara had called it his greatest quality and his worst failing, depending on the day. He picked up the woman, carried her inside, kicked the door shut behind him and set her down on the rug in front of the fireplace. He got the fire built up fast, stripped off her soaked moccasins, wrapped a blanket around her feet. Her hands were the color of wax, and he held them between his own and rubbed until he felt something that might have been circulation start to return. She did not speak for a long time. She lay on the rug with the blanket over her, and her dark eyes watched the fire and occasionally tracked to him and then back to the fire. He brought her a tin cup of water heated on the stove, and she took it with both hands and drank it slowly. He heated beef broth, and she took that too, carefully, as if each swallow required concentration. When she finally spoke, it was in a language he did not know, low and measured, and he shook his head. "English," he said. A pause. Then, "Some. You're safe," he said. "Storm will be done by morning." She studied him for a long time. Her eyes were the darkest brown he had ever seen, and they had a steadiness in them, even now, that did not fit the rest of what he was looking at, the ice in her hair, the trembling she was trying not to show, the exhaustion sitting on her like a second coat. She held herself with a kind of controlled dignity that struck him as deliberate, a thing she was keeping lit against the cold and the circumstances. "My horse," she said. "Threw me. In the canyon. North Canyon? Yes. That was better than 2 miles from the cabin in flat weather. In that storm it was a wonder she had found the cabin at all." He kept that thought to himself. "The horse'll shelter on the canyon wall," he said. "I'll look in the morning." She said something in her own language very quietly, which he suspected was a word of thanks, and then she closed her eyes. He built the fire higher, got himself a chair from the kitchen table, and sat up through the night. He had not planned to sit up. He had planned to give her the bedroom and sleep in the kitchen, like a man with normal manners. But she was shaking even now in front of a fire hot enough to blister pine, and something told him she should not be left alone in a strange cabin in the condition she was in. So he sat. At some point near midnight she opened her eyes and found him still there, and said, in careful English, "You did not have to stay." "I know," he said. She looked at the fire. "My name is Itza. Jonah Carver," he said. "This is my ranch." "I know whose land this is," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite an edge, but was near one. He did not push on it. By morning the storm had broken and the sky was the flat white of old bone. Jonah got up at first light and went to the door to breathe the cold air and check the cattle. And that was when he saw them. They came out of the tree line along the north ridge in a line, riding slow. He counted before he stopped counting. There were at least 40, and they were armed, and they were looking at his cabin. The nearest rider was perhaps 200 yards away, and they had all stopped now, sitting their horses in a silence that was somehow louder than the storm had been. He went back inside. Itza was sitting up, and from the look in her eyes she already knew. "My father's men," she said simply. Jonah put his hand on the back of a chair and breathed out once. "Steady. Your father," he said. "Chief Black Otter," she said. She was watching him carefully. "They will think I was taken." "Were you?" She held his gaze. "I am sitting by your fire drinking your broth," she said. "You tell me what that looks like from the tree line." He almost smiled at that. He suppressed it. How many of those men want to put an arrow in me, regardless of what you say? She considered this with a seriousness he found he respected. Some, she said. One in particular. That one was Cuts the Wind, she told him. A warrior of her father's band who was older than her by a decade, and who had made it clear through the proper channels that he wanted her as his wife. Her father had not refused him outright. Black Otter was a man who understood political realities, but Itza had made her own feelings on the subject so consistently clear that the matter had been left unresolved, which meant Cuts the Wind was carrying a particular kind of grievance, and a white rancher who had sheltered Itza overnight was going to look to him like the specific answer to a question he'd been asking for 2 years. I need to go out there, Jonah said. You need to go slowly. He understood that. He took off the gun belt and hung it on the peg by the door. He looked at her once more, at the dark eyes steady as river stones, and he opened the door and walked out. The cold hit him fresh, and the sun was still low enough to throw long blue shadows across the snow. He walked to the middle of the yard, maybe 50 feet from the porch, and he stood there with his hands away from his sides, and he waited. The riders held for a long moment, and then one of them walked his horse forward from the line. He was a big man on a gray horse, wearing a heavy blanket robe and carrying a rifle across his saddle. His face was broad and carved with a particular expression of a man who has spent a great deal of his life outdoors making hard decisions. Chief Black Otter stopped his horse 8 feet from Jonah Carver and looked down at him without speaking. Jonah had spent enough years in the Montana Territory to know that the right thing to do was nothing. He stood still. He waited. From behind him he heard the cabin door open. Itza came out. She walked past Jonah and stopped beside him, close enough that their arms almost touched, and she spoke to her father in their language for a long time. Her voice was low and level, and when she was done she was quiet, and Black Otter's eyes moved from his daughter to Jonah and back again. He said something in a deep voice that carried. Itza translated without turning her head. He asks why you brought her inside. Because she would have died outside, Jonah said. Another exchange longer? He asks what you want for it. Nothing, Jonah said. A long silence. Black Otter's horse shifted, and he steadied it with one hand, effortless. Then the chief spoke again. He says you are either a very brave man or a very stupid one, Itza said. And now there was the faintest trace of something in her voice that was not quite amusement, but was in the same neighborhood. He says he does not yet know which. Neither do I most of the time, Jonah said. He did not know if the translation came through exactly as intended. But Black Otter looked at him for another long moment, and then something shifted in the set of his face. Not warmth, not yet. Nothing that simple, but a kind of provisional acknowledgment of something. Then the chief spoke again, and this time Itza's voice went careful. He says his band has been pushed from their wintering ground in the south, she said. Soldiers. They have 60 horses and not enough grass and not enough shelter. He says the draw below your north pasture is protected from the wind. She paused. He says if you will let them winter their horses in your north pasture, under your care, he will call what happened last night settled. If you will not, yes, Jonah said. Itza turned her head and looked at him for the first time since she'd come out of the cabin. You didn't let me finish, she said. I know what the other half of that sentence was, he said. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and spoke to her father. Black Otter listened. A long silence followed, long enough for Jonah to register the cold moving through his coat, and the distant sound of one of his own cattle moving in the lower pasture. Then the chief turned his horse and rode back to the line and spoke to his men. They did not lower their rifles immediately, but they did not raise them either. Itza came to stand beside Jonah again. He accepted, she said. I gathered. You understand what you agreed to, she said. It was not quite a question. 60 horses in my north pasture through the winter, he said. I've got enough hay stored to manage most of it if we're careful. I'll need to break more ice in the creek daily, and I'll need another pair of hands. She looked at him steadily. You agreed without negotiating. There wasn't much to negotiate, he said. She looked back at the line of riders along the ridge. Cuts the Wind will not like this, she said. No, Jonah agreed. I don't imagine he will. They stood there for a moment in the cold silence of the cleared morning. Two people who had known each other for approximately 8 hours, watching a chief and his warriors adjust the terms of something that had no name yet. That was the beginning. The horses came down from the ridge that afternoon, 60 of them, beautiful animals, a mix of paints and bays and a handful of grays, lean with hard travel but well-muscled. They moved into the north pasture like a river finding a valley, and Jonah watched from the fence rail with a complicated feeling in his chest that he couldn't fully account for. The band set up camp in the draw below the pasture, sheltered from the north wind by the ridge and close enough to the creek that water was manageable. They worked with the efficient quietness of people who had done this many times before. Camp circles going up, fires laid, children settled. Jonah counted about 90 people in total, men and women, and a number of children who were smaller than they should have been for the season, and who looked at him with the open curiosity of the very young. Itza had gone with her father. She came back in the early afternoon while Jonah was breaking ice in the water trough, and she walked up to him and stood there and said, "I will help." "I've got it," he said. "I know you have it," she said. "I am not offering because I think you cannot. I am offering because 60 horses is a great deal of work and you have 2 hands." He stopped and looked at her. She was wearing her own dry clothes now, a buckskin dress with beadwork along the hem, a blanket over her shoulders, her dark hair braided back. She stood straight in the cold with the particular carriage of someone who had never been taught to make herself smaller. "All right," he said, and handed her the second ice bar he kept on the fence post. They worked side by side for an hour without talking much. She was stronger than she looked, and she knew what she was doing around horses. She moved among them easily. None of the 60 animals shying from her, and she knew how to read a horse's condition from the way it stood. She pointed out 2 that she said were showing signs of the cold sickness, and Jonah looked at them and agreed, and they brought those 2 into the barn. "You know horses," he said. "My mother's father was a horse raider," she said, without any particular weight on it, just as information. "It was his gift to the family. What happened to him?" She looked at him. "He died the way most horse raiders die," she said, "old and proud and with too many horses in the pasture." He found himself smiling at that, the first real smile he had managed in longer than he could easily calculate. That evening he made a pot of venison stew. He had the hindquarter from a deer he'd taken 10 days before, and he was about to eat alone at the kitchen table when there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Itza, and behind her a girl of maybe 8 years old with enormous dark eyes and a cold reddened face. "This is Bright Water," Itza said. "My cousin's daughter. She has not eaten today." Jonah moved back from the door without speaking. They came in. He got another bowl, then a second for Itza. They sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and ate by lamplight while the wind that had not entirely given up pushed against the windows. Bright Water ate with the focused speed of a child who had been hungry for days and was trying not to show how hungry she was. Halfway through the bowl, she looked up and studied Jonah with a directness that only children manage without it being rude. She said something in her language. Itza answered her. Then to Jonah. "She asks why there are 2 chairs by the fire and only one person lives here." Something shifted in Jonah's chest, not painfully, but not without weight. "Tell her, a chair is for remembering someone," he said. Itza translated. Brightwater considered this with the gravity of a child who has already learned that some things should be accepted without further questions. Then she went back to the stew. After the girl had eaten her fill and fallen asleep on the rug by the fire, which had happened almost instantaneously, as if she had simply run out of the energy needed to stay awake, Jonah and Itza sat at the table with coffee he had brewed, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. "Her parents," he said quietly, "her father died in the summer," Itza said. "A confrontation with soldiers near the southern border. Her mother is alive but sick. The cold is making it worse." Jonah turned the coffee cup in his hands. "What's her name?" "The mother's." "Singing Branch," Itza said. She glanced at him sideways. "Why?" "I have medicines," he said. Clara kept a good supply. "Medicines for chest sickness and fever. Half of it I couldn't tell you what it is, but the labels are in English if there's someone in your camp who reads it." Itza set down her cup very carefully and looked at him in the lamplight for a long moment. "There is not," she said. "Then I'll come myself," he said, if your father will allow it." She was quiet for a moment. "You pulled me out of a blizzard," she said. "You gave 60 horses your north pasture without negotiating. And now you are offering your medicines." "Your cousin's daughter ate 3 bowls of stew," he said. It seemed relevant. Something crossed her face then that was different from the cautious steadiness she had been carrying since the night before. Not a smile exactly, but what a smile grows from. "Black Otter will allow it," she said. The next 2 weeks passed, the way hard work in cold weather always passes fast and heavy, and somehow cleaner than ordinary time. Jonah's days took on a shape he hadn't had since Clara died. Up before light, cattle first, then the 60 horses in the north pasture, breaking ice twice a day when it was this cold. He had sent word to Pete and Orlo Twitchell that he needed them every day until further notice, and they had come without complaint. Good men in the way that men who don't ask questions are sometimes good. Itza came to the north pasture every morning. It was never discussed or arranged. It simply happened, the way things happen when they are already decided by the logic of circumstances. They worked alongside each other, and they talked haltingly at first, then more easily, about the horses, about the weather, about the way the light hit the ridge at different hours. She was teaching him words in her language. He was terrible at it, and she was honestly amused by this, in the particular way of someone who does not allow themselves to be openly amused, but cannot entirely suppress it. He learned the word for horse, and the word for snow, and the word for fire, and he learned the phrase that meant something close to, "I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm doing it anyway," which she said was a useful phrase to know. He told her about Wyoming, about building the cabin, about the first winter when the snow came early, and he had made it through on elk jerky and stubbornness alone. He told her about the horses he'd had before the Black Angus, and about the time a grizzly had gotten into the barn, and he'd had to chase it out with a lantern and a lot of noise. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 12, about learning the band's movement patterns from her grandmother, who was the oldest woman anyone could remember, and who said she had been born when the mountains were new, which Itza suspected was an exaggeration. She told him about the southern ground they had been pushed from, good winter ground in a sheltered canyon where her family had wintered for 3 generations, and the way it felt to lead horses north in late November, not knowing what they would find. She did not tell him these things all at once. She told him in pieces, the way people tell things when they are still deciding how much to trust the person they are telling them to. He told her about Clara in pieces, too, over several evenings. The fever, the October light on the grave marker, the rocking chair. Itza listened to all of it without filling the silences, which was rarer than it should have been. One evening she went to the rocking chair and stood beside it for a moment, and then she put her hand on its back very briefly, in a gesture that was not about him, but was for him. And then she went and sat at the kitchen table. He found he could not have said what the gesture cost her to make, or what it meant entirely, only that it mattered. He visited Singing Branch twice in the first week and 3 times in the second. He brought the medicines from Clara's chest, the patent cough syrup, and the quinine and the willow bark compounds, and Itza translated his instructions with the same careful attention she brought to everything. The chest sickness did not resolve quickly, but it stabilized, and the color began to return to Singing Branch's face by the end of the second week. Bright water started appearing at the cabin door most mornings. She helped with small things, carrying wood, filling the water bucket, with the industrious purposefulness of a child who needs to contribute to feel safe. Jonah began saving her a biscuit from his morning cooking. He did not remark on any of this to himself until the evening he came in from the barn and found the lamp already lit in the kitchen, and Itza at the table, teaching Brightwater to play checkers on the board he'd forgotten he owned. He stood in the doorway with the cold still on him, and took that in for a moment before they noticed him, and something happened in his chest that was new and a little frightening and unmistakable. He stamped the snow off his boots and said nothing and came inside. Cuts the wind came to the ranch on the 16th day. Jonah saw him cross the yard from the barn, riding a tall roan horse with the casual confidence of a man who goes where he wants and does not see the need to announce himself. He was perhaps 45, lean and hard, in the way of men who have lived hard, with a face that had been arranged by life into something close to contempt as its resting expression. He was wearing a trade blanket robe and carrying a rifle that he did not unsling. He stopped his horse in front of the cabin porch and called out in his own language, "Sharp and carrying." Itza appeared in the doorway before Jonah reached it. She answered him in a voice that was flat and entirely controlled. A short exchange, hard-edged. Then Cuts the Wind spoke again and pointed at the north pasture, and Jonah caught the shape of the gesture even without the words, "This is our territory now," was what that gesture said, or something close to it. Itza answered him briefly and firmly. He said something else, looking past her at Jonah with an expression that was not quite threat and not quite contempt, but had both in it. He rode back out of the yard without hurrying. "He says you are trying to buy us," Itza told Jonah. "With hay and broken ice," Jonah said. "He says white men always have a price in mind." She paused. "He said it to me, not to you, because he believes the price I am paying is obvious." Jonah was quiet for a moment. "And your father?" "My father is a reasonable man who sees what is in front of him," she said. "He sees his band's horses in good condition and his granddaughter's appetite improving. He does not think you are buying anything." She looked out toward the ridge. "Cuts the Wind has never been a reasonable man. He is a brave man and a good warrior, but he has never been reasonable. Is he dangerous?" She looked at him with the particular patience of someone answering a question that should not need to be asked. "Yes," she said. "Of course he is." 3 days later, 2 white men rode into the valley from the south. Jonah recognized one of them, a man named Torp, who ran a small operation on the far side of the ridge and had a reputation for operating along whatever lines were most convenient for Torp at any given moment. The other, one Jonah did not know. They came to the ranch yard in the late afternoon, and Torp pulled his horse up and tipped his hat in a way that was not friendly. "Heard you had guests," Torp said. "Ranch is full," Jonah said. He had come out of the barn with a pitchfork and did not set it down. Torp's eyes moved to the north pasture where the horses were moving against the gray winter light, 60 of them dark against the snow. "Nice remuda," Torp said. "They're not mine," Jonah said. "That a fact." Torp leaned forward on his saddle horn. "Army's offering good money for Apache horses. Said in town they're trying to pin down a renegade band." "There are no renegades in this valley," Jonah said. "There are people who have a winter agreement with this ranch. That's all." Torp looked at him for a long time. The other man said nothing, just sat his horse with the particular stillness of someone who is waiting for whatever happens next. "Winter's long," Torp said pleasantly. Then he turned his horse and rode back south. Jonah stood in the yard and watched them go, and then went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a while, thinking through the geometry of the problem. Torp would be back, or Torp would talk to someone, and that someone would come instead. The army had a post 30 miles east, and if they got it into their heads that there was a displaced band wintering in the Bitterroot foothills, there would be soldiers in the valley before the week was out. And 60 horses was enough to draw men for reasons that had nothing to do with the army. He went to Black Otter's camp that evening for the first time. He told Itza what had happened. She translated for her father, who listened without expression. Black Otter asked 2 questions. Jonah answered them. The chief was quiet for a time, looking at the fire, and then he said something long, and Itza translated. He says Torp is not the danger. He says the danger is that Torp will speak to the soldier post, and the soldiers will come with the right to move us east to the reservation land. He says the band cannot go east. The eastern ground is fever ground. His people have been east before, and they did not return the same. She paused. He says he trusts you with the information of what happened. He does not trust easily. I understand, Jonah said. He did not have a solution that night. He went home and lay awake for a long time listening to the cold ranch settle and thinking about the geometry of the problem, about what he could do and what he couldn't, and what it would cost. In the morning he rode to Missoula. He had a conversation with a lawyer he had known marginally for 3 years, a man named Ferguson, who had done some land title work for him when he'd expanded the ranch boundary. He explained the situation in straightforward terms, and Ferguson listened with the careful attention of a man calculating what he is being asked to risk, and what the value of it might be. It took Jonah most of his savings and a future claim on 40 head of cattle to get Ferguson to write the letters. 3 letters, one to the territorial governor's office in Helena, one to the Indian Affairs office in the same city, and one to the army post east of Missoula. The letters stated that the horses in Jonah Carver's north pasture were under a winter boarding agreement, and represented the legal property of a Chiricahua band that had made no hostile moves, committed no trespass, and was wintering on land provided by a citizen of the territory under a private agreement. He was not certain the letters would hold. He was not certain they would even arrive in time to matter. But Ferguson's name meant something in the territorial capital, and it was better than nothing. He got back to the ranch in the late afternoon and told Itza what he had done. She was quiet for a long time. "That was your savings," she said. "Part of it for the letters and Ferguson's fee." She looked at him with something that had shifted past, careful, past measured, into something older and less defended. "You spent your savings," she said, "to write letters to the government of the people who pushed us from our wintering ground." "It's what I had available," he said. She turned away and looked out the window at the north pasture and the horses moving in the last light. He watched her profile. There was something happening in her face that she was containing with effort. "Itza," he said. "Don't," she said. Not sharply, quietly, as if she was asking for a moment. He gave her the moment. When she turned back, her face was composed again, but the steadiness was a different quality now, not the controlled steadiness she had arrived with. Something had been let through. "My father needs to know," she said. "I know," he said. She nodded and went out. The trouble came on a Thursday. It came from two directions which Jonah had half expected, because trouble rarely comes from one direction when two people are carrying it. Torp brought 4 men with him. They came before dawn, while the light was still gray, and the horses in the north pasture were moving restlessly in the way that horses move when something has disturbed them. Jonah was already at the barn when he heard them on the south road, and he went to the fence rail with his rifle and waited. They pulled up short when they saw him. "Just having a look at those horses," Torp said. "You've had your look," Jonah said. "Now you're going to turn those horses around and go back the way you came." "There's 5 of us," Torp said pleasantly. From the tree line above the south pasture, 3 of Black Otter's men emerged, not urgently, not theatrically, just stepping out of the trees and standing there with their own weapons visible. One of them was the young warrior who had been posted to the south side of the valley since Torp's first visit, a man Itza had said was one of her father's most reliable. Torp looked at the warriors, he looked at Jonah, he did the arithmetic. "Another time," Torp said, and turned his horse. Jonah watched them go and released the breath he'd been holding. That was the south. Cuts the Wind came from the north. An hour later, he came into the ranch yard openly, on foot, which was itself a kind of declaration. 3 other men came with him, also on foot, also armed. Jonah was on the porch and he stayed on it. Cuts the Wind spoke in his own language, looking at Jonah, and his voice was not loud but carried easily in the cold morning. Itza had come out of the barn where she had been checking on the 2 sick horses. She stood in the yard between the porch and the men, and she answered her father's rival warrior with a voice that was low and absolutely steady, and went on for several sentences. Cuts the Wind replied. His eyes moved to Jonah and back to Itza, and back to Jonah, and his expression said what his words, in whatever language they were in, apparently also said. Then he said something to Itza that was short, and from the way her shoulders went still, Jonah understood it was an ultimatum of some kind. She answered him with 3 words. Jonah did not need the translation. He could read the shape of it. Cuts the Wind stood there for a moment with the particular stillness of a man who has heard the answer he was afraid of. And then he turned, and the 4 of them went back north toward the camp. Itza turned to face Jonah. Her face was composed, but her hands were not quite steady. "He will appeal to my father," she said. "What did you say to him?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I said that my father's horses are fat and well-watered, and Singing Branch is recovering from sickness, and Bright Water is eating biscuits for breakfast. I said that the man who did these things did them freely, without a price, and that I was capable of knowing the difference between a man who wants something from me and a man who simply saw a person who needed to come inside." Jonah was quiet. "And the last thing," he said, "the 3 words." She held his gaze. "I told him the matter was decided. That afternoon, Black Otter called a gathering of the men of the band. Jonah was not present for it. He stayed at the ranch and did the afternoon work, water, hay, cattle, the 2 sick horses, and tried not to think about what was happening a quarter-mile to the north. Itza came to the cabin in the early evening. She came inside without being asked, and she sat at the kitchen table, and he put coffee in front of her. "My father ruled against cuts the wind," she said. Jonah sat down across from her. "He took it. He has to," she said. "My father is still the chief. What he decides is decided." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. Cuts the Wind did not speak again after the ruling. That is, its own kind of answer. He may leave the band before the winter is over. Is that bad for your people? She considered this. He is a strong warrior, and some men follow him who follow my father less loyally. If he goes, it will weaken the band in terms of fighting strength. She paused. But some problems grow smaller when they leave the room. Jonah almost said something. He decided against it. "You said the matter was decided," he said instead. Itza looked at the table and then at him. Outside the window, the last light was going over the ridge, and the ranch was going quiet, in the way it went quiet at this hour. "I said what I believed," she said. "My father has no use for soft answers to hard questions. He respects things said plainly. And you?" Jonah said. A long silence. The fire shifted. "I am the chief's daughter," she said. "I also have no use for soft answers." He looked at her across the kitchen table with the lamplight between them and the coal pressed against every wall, and he said, "Then here is a plain one. The chair by the fire was for remembering someone. I have been remembering her for 14 months. I think she would have told me to stop, some time ago. I think she would have said the ranch needed a person in it, not a monument." Itza did not look away. "I think," she said, after a moment, that she would have been right. He reached across the table and set his hand over hers, and she did not pull away. The winter did not get easier after that. Winters in the high Montana country do not adjust themselves for the convenience of the people in them. The cold held through February and into the first weeks of March, and twice the temperature dropped low enough that even the dry cold cracked the cabin's north-facing logs, and Jonah had to spend a day with Oakham and pitch sealing me. Gaps. He lost 2 calves to the cold in February. One of the band's horses, the weakest of the sick ones, did not make it to February at all. But the north pasture held. The hay held, Singing Branch's chest cleared by the middle of January, and by February she was helping with the camp cooking. Brightwater stopped appearing at the cabin door every morning only because she started appearing before Jonah was up, and he began leaving the door unlatched for her. Itza was at the ranch most days. She had taken over the management of the sick horses with a competence that made Pete and Orlo Twitchell regard her with the respectful wariness of men who have had their professional assumptions quietly overturned. She and Jonah spoke more easily now, the stiffness of those first days worn away by cold work and shared meal times and a habit of honesty. She told him about the Chiricahwa's way with horses, the particular methods her grandfather's family had developed over generations for reading an animal's condition, for treating the common ailments of winter and travel, for building the trust that made a horse ride easy in rough ground. Some of it Jonah knew, and some of it he didn't, and the parts he didn't know he applied, and found they worked. He told her about the ranch's history, about the years before Clara when it had been just the work and the seasons, and no one else. About the way Montana light changed in the different months, the summer evenings that went on and on. The specific quality of autumn before the cold came in. She had only known the territory in winter. He wanted her to see the rest of it. He told her that once in the evenings over coffee, and she had listened to him describe the summer valley with those steady dark eyes, and then she had said, "Perhaps I will." Torp did not come back. Whether Ferguson's letters had reached the right offices, or whether the 5-against-5 arithmetic of that January morning had simply clarified the risk, Jonah did not know and did not go looking to find out. The army posts sent no riders. The valley stayed quiet. Cuts the Wind left the band in early February, as Itza had predicted. 6 men went with him, west toward the mountains. Black Otter watched them go with the particular expressionlessness of a man who has spent a lifetime not showing the things he feels in front of people who would use them. He came to the ranch himself, 10 days after Cuts the Wind left. Alone, Jonah was splitting wood in the yard when he arrived. He set the axe down and waited. Black Otter dismounted and stood in the yard, and the 2 men looked at each other in the cold morning. Then the chief spoke without Itza to translate, which meant Jonah understood only the shape of it, the cadence of a formal statement, the pauses in the right places, the tone that said this was a thing being said once and meant. He held Jonah's eyes while he spoke. When he was done, he reached into his coat and produced a short-handled knife in a beaded sheath, and he held it out. Jonah understood gift-giving enough to know that not taking it was not an option. He took it with both hands, which he hoped was the right way. He looked at the beadwork on the sheath, and then at the chief. Black Otter said one word. Jonah did not know it. He found out later from Itza. The word was the Chiricahua term for a man who was part of the family, not by blood but by conduct. It did not translate neatly into English. March came, and the hardest cold broke. The creek ran under the ice first, audible before visible, a sound that Jonah had learned to love from his first Montana winter, the deep, cold, alive sound of water moving again after months of stillness. Then the ice pulled back from the banks, and by the middle of March the south-facing slopes were showing the first color. The horses were in good condition. All 58 of them, 2 had been lost over the winter, as expected, were in good weight, their winter coats still thick but their eyes clear and their movement easy. They had come through. Black Otter set the departure date for the 3rd week of March, when the worst of the mud would have firmed and the southern passes would be open enough to move the horses through without risk. The band began the slow work of breaking camp, not quickly, not anxiously, but with the methodical care of people who have done this many times. Jonah did not let himself think about it until 3 days before they were due to leave. He was in the barn in the evening, and Itza came in and sat on a hay bale, and watched him work for a while in companionable silence, the way she did sometimes. He said, without looking up, "The South Canyon they pushed you out of." "Yes," she said. "Is it gone, or just occupied?" "The soldiers made a route through it, a supply road. They do not garrison it in winter." She paused. "In summer they will." "So it's gone. For our purposes," she said. "Yes." He finished what he was doing and turned to look at her. "Where does the band winter, then, after this year?" She looked at him. He looked at her. "The north pasture," he said, "will be empty again in the fall. The hay comes in by August. There's water in the creek." A long silence. Outside the barn the horses moved and settled, the particular nighttime sounds of a full pasture. "My father would need to agree," she said. "I imagine you'll need to discuss it with your father," Jonah said. "About several things." She held his gaze for what seemed a long time. Then she said, "He will want to know your intentions. He asks plainly. He expects plain answers." "I know," Jonah said. "I'm counting on it." The morning the band departed, the valley was clear and cold, and the sky was the hard pale blue of early Montana spring. The horses came out of the north pasture in a long, moving line, and Jonah stood at the fence rail and watched them go. Bright Water came to him before she left. She hugged him around the middle with both arms and then stepped back and said something in her language with great formality, looking at him squarely. He looked at Itza. "She says thank you for the biscuits," Itza said. "She says they were the best biscuits in the Bitterroot." "Tell her that's high praise," Jonah said, "since she's the only person who ever ate them." Black Otter stopped his horse beside Jonah when the band was moving and looked at him without speaking for a moment. Then he said something brief and direct and rode on. "He says the horses wintered better here than they would have on the southern ground," Itza told him when the chief had passed. "He says he remembers that." She stood beside Jonah at the fence rail while the last of the horses went through the gap in the north fence and began climbing toward the ridge. The spring light caught the dust. They raised and turned it gold. She did not go with them. She stood there with her hands on the top rail of the fence, and her dark eyes on the ridge where the last horse was now disappearing, and she did not move. Jonah stood beside her. After a while she said, "My father knows." "I figured," he said. "He is not opposed," she said. "He made some conditions. I told him I had already considered them all." She looked at him. "I told him I was staying." The valley was quiet around them. The cattle had come down from the upper pasture to the creek and were drinking in the first warmth of the morning. A hawk was riding a thermal above the south ridge. "You still haven't seen the summer," Jonah said. "No," she said. "I haven't." He put his hand over hers on the fence rail. From the ridge above, if you were one of the last riders cresting it before the trail turned south, You would have seen a man and a woman standing at a fence line in the high Montana Valley, with the creek behind them running full and clear, and the season turning around them, two figures small against the wide sky, standing close enough that there was no distance left between them worth measuring. 6 weeks later, on an evening at the end of April when the meadow below the cabin had gone green and the cottonwoods along the creek were putting out their first leaves, Jonah Carver asked Itza a question in the kitchen after supper, as direct and plain as he knew how to be. She answered him in kind. They were married in 2 ceremonies in the 2nd week of May, once by the circuit pastor who came through the valley monthly, and once on the ridge above the north pasture by a Chiricahua ceremony conducted by Black Otter himself, with the band having returned for the occasion, 58 horses and 90 people coming back up through the southern pass as the last snow was giving way. Brightwater stood beside Itza for both ceremonies with the dignity of a child who understands that she is part of something that matters. The North Pasture Agreement was made permanent that summer. It became a known thing in the territory, the Carver Ranch in the Bitterroot foothills, where the Chiricahua horses wintered. Some people had opinions about it. Most of those people had never spent a Montana winter, and their opinions did not carry much weight with Jonah. He moved Clara's rocking chair from the cold side of the fireplace to the warm side. Itza sat in it the first time late on a May evening, while the last light was going over the ridge and the cabin was warm, and the cattle were quiet, and Brightwater was asleep in the back room that had been emptied out and furnished for. The purpose. She put her hands on the arms of the chair and rocked it once, slowly, looking at the fire. She was well loved, Itza said. Not as a question. She was, Jonah said. Itza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, good. That was the kind of woman she was. The valley learned them slowly, the way a valley learns anything, through seasons and through the work done in them, through the accumulation of ordinary days, through a rancher who broke ice twice a day all winter, and a woman who moved among horses with the ease of long inheritance, through a child who ate biscuits at a kitchen table and grew up taller than anyone expected, and who spoke 2 languages with equal fluency, and who said much later that the 2 chairs by the fire were for remembering and for living, and that the 2 things were not opposites. There are places in Montana where the light in late October turns everything the color of old gold before it goes. The valley in the Bitterroot foothills is one of those places. In the years that followed, that light fell on a ranch that was more full than it had ever been. More horses, more voices, more of the particular warmth that comes not from a fire, but from the people gathered near it. Jonah Carver had come to Montana with 1 horse and a stubbornness that his father said would either make him rich or kill him. His father had been wrong about both in the end. It had done something else entirely, something that did not have a tidy name, and that was better than either.